Okay, so first of all, I would like to thank all of you for being here today and also for the invitation. Okay, so in the talk, I will address the question of what are the political implications of ethnic inequality. My talk will mainly be based on 4 articles I published, although I will also borrow from some of the other work I did also. The first article was actually a chapter from my dissertation that I eventually published in World Politics. The paper was about the effect of ethnic inequality on the consolidation of democracy, so on the survival and consolidation of democracy. Also did 3 other co-authored papers that I published between 2017 and 2019 on related subjects. So these were published in the Journal of Politics, Journal of Peace Research, and also Political Behavior. Okay. And my motivation in the beginning to start working on this topic was that while the previous literature had investigated the consequences of inequality on different political phenomena, there was very little work on the effect of ethnic inequality. Okay? So, for example, there's a lot of work on the effect of inequality, so the overall level of inequality in a society, for example, measured with a Gini coefficient, on voting behavior or the consolidation of democracy, but very little work on the effect of ethnic inequality. So, for example, inequality between people of different ethnic groups. Here, the big exception is that there was a literature on civil war looking at this question, but not on other type of political phenomena. However, in many instances, the key actors that drive these outcomes are ethnic groups. So, for example, a large proportion of military coups are actually ethnic coups. So coups during which the key coalition behind the coup leaders are ethnic groups. So this ethnic group, or these ethnic group in some cases, will be key both during the the coup itself, so during the coup, and afterwards while establishing a new regime. So ethnic inequality is likely to be more relevant to such instances, to such cases, than the overall level of inequality in a society. Okay. So in this presentation, I will look at the implications of ethnic inequality on 3 main topics. The first topic is democratic stability. The second one is ethnic coups. And the third one is ethnic voting. And I distinguish between 2 different dimensions of ethnic inequality. The first dimension is between ethnic group inequality, which is often called also in the literature horizontal inequality. And this is the degree to which members of different ethnic groups have different wealth or income level. So it's basically an inequality between people of different ethnicity. The second dimension of ethnic inequality is within ethnic group inequality. And this is the level of inequality among members of the same ethnic group. Okay? And one thing is that most of the previous literature that had looked at the subject of ethnic inequality really focused only on the first dimension of ethnic inequality. Okay? So my key argument is that inequality between ethnic groups fosters democratic breakdowns, coups, and ethnic voting, but that the magnitude of its effect is strongest when within ethnic group inequality is low. So basically, we're more likely to have democratic breakdowns, coups, and ethnic voting when there's a lot of inequality between groups, but a low level of inequality within group. Okay? And I propose 2 mechanisms that could drive the relationship. So according to the first one, at low level of within group inequality, between group inequality will increase the degree to which individuals identify with their ethnicity. Okay, so the first mechanism is really about ethnic identification and how ethnic inequality affects ethnic identification. And the second one is that at low level of within group inequality, between group inequality will widen the gap between the policy preferences of members of different ethnic groups. So this, especially over economic policies. So the second mechanism is about policy preferences, and the first one about ethnic identification. And I use a large number of multinational surveys to construct indicators of both between and within group inequality. The dataset covers more than 100 countries worldwide, and include both measures at the ethnic group level and at the country level. So basically what I mean here, at the country level will be the overall level of, for example, between group inequality in a country, and at the ethnic group level will be that for each country, I have a different between group inequality score for each ethnic group of that country. Okay, so I also have a score at the level of the ethnic group itself. And I find support for my hypothesis. So basically, I find that within group inequality, when within group inequality is low, between group inequality destabilizes democracy, fosters economic voting, and increases the likelihood of coups. And I also find strong evidence in favor of the two mechanisms. Okay, so there are two main literature that relates to my topic. The first one is the relatively old or the classical literature on cross-cutting and reinforcing cleavages. This literature argues that individuals identify more strongly with members of their group along one cleavage, so one cleavage could be class, religion, ethnicity, if they share membership with them on other cleavages. Okay, so individuals, for example, will be more likely to identify with their race if they are a member of the same, if they share also religion with them. Okay, if people from the same racial group have also the same religion. In these cases, we say that cleavages reinforce each other. So these different cleavages reinforce each other. So basically, individuals are more likely to perceive themselves as fundamentally different from one another when cleavages reinforce each other. On the other hand, individuals are less likely to identify with members of their group along one cleavage when they share membership with members of other groups along different cleavages. So for example, they should be less likely to identify with their race if some members of their racial group have different religion. Okay, so in these cases, we will say the cleavages cross-cut each other. So the key argument of this literature is that reinforcing cleavages shall magnify the impact of any particular social cleavage on political behavior, while cross-cutting cleavages shall weaken it. A more recent literature builds on this literature and focuses on the interaction between two specific cleavages, so ethnicity and inequality. And until very recently, this literature focused almost exclusively on civil wars. So most of these studies only look at between group inequality, which again is the first of the two dimensions of inequality that I will discuss. And these authors typically find that between group inequality increases the negative impact of ethnicity on politics. And here by negative impact, I mean cases like that between group inequality will increase the likelihood of ethnic civil wars. Okay, so there's also a smaller group of authors that also look at the effect of within group inequality. Some of them look at the unconditional effect of between and within group inequality. And what I mean here by unconditional, I mean that they assume that the effect of between group inequality does not depend on within group inequality. Okay, so they look at them separately without looking at the interaction between them, okay, whether the effect depends on each other. There's also, and also others, and here is really where my contribution is situated, look at the effect of between group inequality conditional on within group inequality. And here there are two main schools of thoughts on the studies on civil wars, which were those that preceded my own work. Okay? According to the first school of thought, within group inequality strengthens the effect of civil wars, the effect of between group inequality on civil wars. So according to these authors, when there's more inequality between group and also a lot of inequality within group, that's when we are more likely to have civil war. And here the mechanism is really based on the process of a civil war, so how civil wars happen. Okay? In order to fight a civil war, you need to mobilize a large fighting force. Okay? So you need to be able to mobilize a large fighting force, arm them, and basically finance the war. And the idea is that when there's a lot of inequality within group, there's a large group of people with a very low opportunity cost within that group that are willing to fight for very low salary in exchange. Okay? So it reduces the cost of potential fighters. At the same time, it concentrated resource within the hand of a small elite that is able to finance the war. Okay, so they are able to pay for the fighters and at the same time to arm them. According to the second school of thought, within group inequality weakens the effect of between group inequality on civil war. So basically the complete opposite hypothesis. And this is basically because it argues that that within group inequality reduces within group cohesion. Because it creates cross-cutting cleavages. Okay, so I argue that the arguments of the first school of thoughts cannot really be applied to the study of democratic breakdowns, coups, and ethnic voting. And this is because these three different kind of processes don't involve or rarely involve prolonged fighting. Okay. So ethnic voting doesn't involve fighting at all. It can lead to unrest, but the act of voting doesn't involve fighting. So um, that part of the argument is not related. Also, in terms of coups usually happen very quickly. So they don't usually involve prolonged fighting. They happen very quickly. They can involve a relatively small force. And so you don't need to finance a large fighting force for a prolonged period of time. And in terms of democratic breakdowns, they usually happen through two mechanisms. The first mechanism is through a military coup. So the same argument as I just made for coups apply. Or they happen also through incumbent takeover. So somebody gets elected and concentrate power and eventually overthrow the democracy. So these are cases like Putin, will be case also like Hitler was Chavez. So these kind of cases, yeah? In which, but again, that doesn't involve prolonged fighting. So the effect of within group inequality on the capacity to finance a large fighting force is relatively irrelevant to those cases, to those type of outcomes. However, the arguments of the second school of thought are relevant. So deposing a democracy or staging a coup and establishing a new regime requires the creation of a coalition. And often these coalitions are based on a common ethnic identity. And ethnic inequality show affect the capacity of a political entrepreneur to create to form this type of coalition. Okay? Similarly, a group's cohesion affects whether its members will vote for the same party or not, so it affects also ethnic voting. So as I said previously, I argue that between group inequality will foster democratic breakdown, ethnic coups, and ethnic voting, and that the magnitude of its effect is largest at low level within group inequality. So my argument builds directly on the cross-cutting and reinforcing cleavage literature. So in order to have reinforcing cleavages, you really need two things. You need that members of different ethnic groups are part of different social classes, so that we have high level of between group inequality, and that members of the same ethnic group are part of the same social class, so a low level within group inequality. As I said previously, most authors only look at the first aspect. And I propose two mechanisms that could drive the relationship. According to the first mechanism, at low level of within group inequality, between group inequality will increase the salience of ethnicity. Okay? So under these conditions, individuals are likely to see themselves as fundamentally different from people from other groups and similar to those of their own group, which will increase the degree to which they identify with their ethnicity, as opposed, let's say, with their nationality or other form of identity. There's indeed evidence that shows that ethnic identification is weaker when ethnicity is cross-cut by other cleavages. So for example, Dunning and Harrison show that in Mali, members of groups, of ethnic groups in which ethnicity is cross-cut by other cleavages are less likely to identify with their ethnicity. Okay. Another related effect is that when between group inequality is high and within group inequality is low, members of different ethnic groups are unlikely to be in frequent contact with one another. Okay, so they are more likely to be in contact with people of their own group. And this is because income also has implications for other aspects, like the neighborhood in which you live, the schools you attend. And so this should further increase ethnic identification. Ethnic identification, in turn, should foster democratic breakdowns, coups, and ethnic voting. So first, if we look at democratic breakdown, when people identify closely with their ethnicity, it provides a coalition for political entrepreneurs to overthrow the democracy. Also, actually, the ethnicization of politics has many other effects on the survival of democracy. Actually, I have a full paper in democratization on the journal Democratization on only that question. I will not go, of course, to it now, but just another way in which it can also destabilize democracy is that it reduces the ex-ante uncertainty over election. And what I mean here is that you can predict more easily in advance who is going to win the election. So if everybody in the society votes only along ethnic lines, you know who will win the election because it will always be the largest group. So the smaller group, those that will not ever win the election, or have incentive to overthrow the democracy. So it increases the incentive to overthrow the democracy. The mechanism of coups is very similar to that of democratic breakdown. The only thing that is really different is where the regime starts often. So, and actually, in many cases, they are modeled in a similar way. So, coup plotters can more easily gather support to overthrow the previous regime and install a new one when ethnicity and so when they have a coalition that they can use to overthrow the regime. And finally, in terms of ethnic voting, the stronger the sense of in-group identification, the more likely group membership is to affect voting behavior. So you're more likely to vote for a party or candidate that wants to represent the interests of your own group if you identify closely with that group. Okay. According to the second mechanism, at low level of within-group inequality, between-group inequality widens the gap between the policy preferences of different ethnic groups. And here I mean policy preferences in terms of economic policies, mostly. Okay? So poor group should favor poor-friendly economic policies, such as redistribution towards the poor, public education, while rich group should oppose such policies. And here basically it's just that if we have redistribution towards the poor, that will favor the poor groups, and also it's a rich group that are likely to pay for it because, again, it's redistribution towards the poor. Okay? And so the rich group should be more opposed to such policies. And so between group inequality should increase support for redistribution among poor groups and reduce it among rich groups. That's just because the poor groups become poorer and the richer group become richer. So, okay, so the distance in policy preference should increase. And this effect is conditioned by within-group inequality. So when within-group inequality is low, members of the same group have similar preferences over economic policies. And thus, a high between-group inequality level combined with a low level of within-group inequality creates ethnic groups that have drastically different policy preferences, but with homogeneous within-group preferences. This is more likely to lead to intergroup distributional conflict. So again, while the first mechanism was about ethnic identification, how ethnic inequality affects ethnic identification, the second one is about its effect on policy preferences. Now, if we look at the three outcomes of interest, so the groups that are not in power are likely to have different preferences than those that are in power when we have that ethnicity and income reinforce each other, so that they mean that they have a higher payoff in doing a coup against the regime under these conditions, okay, and then implement their own policy preferences. Also, it's easier for political entrepreneurs to build a coalition when members of the group agree over opposed democracy policy, so economic policy in that case. In terms of ethnic coup, it's a similar logic. So again, if we have a lot of inequality between groups, it means that, for example, if we have a regime in which the group in power is rich, that group should put a very low level of redistribution, and then a group that is an outsider should have a preference for higher level of redistribution, so which increases the payoff from doing a coup. And finally, members of the same group are likely to vote for the same parties if they have the same policy preferences. So different parties have different platforms, and so just if people from the same group tend to have the same taste, they will tend to vote for the same party, even if they don't identify with ethnicity, with their group per se. Okay. Okay, so in terms of the data set, in most analyses, the unit of analysis is the ethnic group year. So I test whether the between and within group inequality level of an ethnic group affects the political behavior of that specific group. Okay, so most of my analyses are at the ethnic group level. Okay, so I have measure of within and between group inequality of given ethnic groups. I have also some analyses at the country level that I will not show here, but that are in the papers, and also at the respondent year level that most of them are testing the mechanism. The data set covers a bit more than 100 countries. I rely on a large number of multinational surveys, so the barometers, the demographic and health surveys, international social survey program, the comparative study of the electoral system, and the world value surveys. And these surveys have information both on the ethnicity of the respondent as well as some measure of their wealth or income. And I can use this in order to construct measures of between and within group inequality for each group. Also, I must say that actually I have more survey than this that I didn't process yet. Okay. Identify ethnic groups using the ethnic power relation data set. What I think is one of the main advantages of this data set is that it captures only politically relevant ethnic group. Okay? So that in different contexts, ethnicity is defined, so it's categorized in different ways. So for example, in the US, groups tend to be more defined along a racial line. So for example, we'll have whites, African American, Latinos, whereas in a country like Canada, they will tend to be defined more along linguistic lines, so French Canadian and English Canadian. So it takes into account the context. Of course, I don't cover countries that have only one ethnicity according to the EPR or no ethnic group, because I cannot construct a measure of inequality between and within between group if there's only one group or if there's no group. Now I will explain how I code the three dependent variables of interest, so democratic breakdown, coups, and ethnic voting. So for democratic breakdown, I will first explain how I code it at the country level, and then explain how I use this to code it at the ethnic group level. Okay? So at the country level, a democratic breakdown occurs in year T if a country that was democratic at the end of year T minus 1 is no longer a democracy at the end of year T. So basically, if a country, for example, was a democracy at the end of 1991, and at the end of 1992, it's no longer a democracy, then it had a democratic breakdown in 1992. Okay? So this is a dummy variable, takes the value 0 if there's no breakdown and 1 if there's a breakdown within a given year. Then to construct that at the ethnic group level, I use for each breakdown, I look at biography of those that stage the breakdown to code which ethnic group is responsible for the breakdown. Of course, these analyses include only countries that were democratic at the end of the previous year. That is because, of course, I cannot look at democratic breakdown in countries that are not democratic. For ethnic coups, I take the variable directly from Rossler. He calls a variable that takes the value 1 if a group has staged a coup within a given year. The sample here covers only sub-Saharan Africa. And the reason why, so basically, Rossler data set covers only Africa. And one of the strengths of this data is that it includes only ethnic coups. So coups in which the key correlation was not an ethnic group are not included in that data set. Okay? And we don't have that information for other regions. And finally, for ethnic voting, the surveys also have some information about the voting choice of the respondent. So my co-authors and I, in this paper, calculate a measure of ethnic voting using this. So here, EVI will mean the ethnic voting score of ethnic group I, okay, of group I. Here, J is a given political party. P is the total number of party. New JI is the proportion of members of group I that have voted for party J. And new J minus I is the proportion of members of other groups of the same country that have voted for party J. Okay, so it captures the degree to which members of group I vote differently or for different parties than members of other ethnic groups from the same country. It ranges from 0 to 1, where 1 will mean higher level of ethnic voting. We use that type of measure instead of using something like the proportion of people that have voted for ethnic parties for many reasons, but one of them is that ethnic parties are often banned in many countries, and often they are banned in the countries in which inter-ethnic relationships are the most conflictual. And so that will have will have biased the data. That will have suggested that these countries don't have any kind of ethnic voting. I will explain how I measure the two independent variables, so between and within group inequality. So for between group inequality, again, the surveys have information on the income or wealth of the respondent. The formula used here is the same as what is used in most of the previous, by most authors to measure between group inequality. So here, this gives the average wealth or income of members of group I, and this the average wealth or income of members of citizens from another ethnic group of the same country. Yep. So the measure captures the difference in income or wealth between an average member of group I and an average individual from a different ethnic group of the same country. For within ethnic group inequality, I calculate a Gini coefficient among all members of the same ethnic group. So it's just a Gini coefficient, but the sample is restricted to members of the ethnic group. Okay. Recorded in a way that it ranges from 0 to 1, where 1 means higher level of inequality. So there are three main differences between my data set and that of others. So many others rely on geo-reference data rather than survey data to capture ethnic inequality. So by geo-reference data, so what I mean is that they, for example, they will use map on ethnic settlement and compare that with map, for example, of light emission in order to capture the average wealth of different ethnic groups based on their region. This is a very interesting way, I think, to capture it, but this also has some limitations. So one of them is it's difficult to capture the wealth of an ethnic group when, for example, the ethnic group is dispersed across the country, or when in a given region you have that, or a city that you have people from different ethnicity living in the same region or the same city. Also, it's a bit harder to capture within group inequality. So really difference in income across where a group lives. Another difference is that I capture the between and within group inequality at the ethnic group level. So I said that a few times, but I think it's an important point. And the reason is that between and especially within group inequality vary widely across ethnic group of the same country. Okay, so, and it will not be as precise of a test to use, for example, an aggregate measure that basically capture the within group inequality of all group of the country in order to capture the behavior of a specific group. Okay. And finally, as I said previously, I have an indicator of both between and within group inequality. Okay, so here I show the main results these are the results of 3 of the papers. And a few things. So here, all these models have control variables. I don't show them here just because they have different control variables, and it will just be too much to put on too many slides. But I can discuss them during the Q&A. What are different control variables? Other things, so I just decided to note statistical significance just for clarity with stars, so 3 stars significant at the 1%, 1 star at the 10%, and 2 stars at the 5%. And in parentheses, I have the standard errors. Okay. So here I test the effect of ethnic inequality on the 3 outcomes of interest in succession. So I will go through each of them one after the other. So the first one is democratic breakdown. Again, here the dependent variable takes the value 1 if a given group has staged a democratic breakdown in a year, and 0 otherwise. So the coefficient gives the effect of ethnic inequality on the likelihood that a given group stages a breakdown in a year. Okay. So in the first model, I don't look at the conditional effect of between and within group inequality. I just estimate the effect separately of between and within group inequality. And as you can see, I don't find any evidence that between group inequality increases the likelihood of a democratic breakdown. In the following model, so model 2, this one really tests my hypothesis, okay, so that the effect is interactive, and include an interaction term between and within group inequality, okay, to capture that conditional effect. So what I find is that between group inequality increases the likelihood of breakdown, and that the magnitude of the effect reduces as within group inequality increases. Okay? So here I show the marginal effect of between group inequality on democratic breakdown across different levels of within group inequality. Okay? So here we have within group inequality. Here we have the marginal effect of between group inequality. So what is the impact of between, so if we increase a bit with between group inequality, whether it will increase or decrease the likelihood of a democratic breakdown. And here, so the dotted line are 95% confidence intervals. So what we see is that until within group inequality attains about 0.37, between group inequality increases the likelihood of a breakdown. Afterwards, the effect becomes non-significant, and here it becomes actually negative. One thing I must say is that only 1% of the observation are here, so this is basically an out-of-sample finding. Here, about 50% of the observation are here. So what basically I find is that for the 50% of the sample that is more equal, we have a positive effect. In the other cases, we have a null result. Okay. So this is, I find support for this hypothesis. Then in model 3 and 4, the dependent variable is an ethnic coup. Again, this is a dummy variable. I forgot to say these models were estimated using probit. These are also with probit. So basically, again, when I don't have the interaction term, I don't have any relationship. I don't have that between group inequality has any effect. But when we include the interaction term, we do find a result. So here, between group inequality increase the likelihood of a coup, and magnitude of the effect reduces as within group inequality increases. Here, I have basically the same graph as before. So again, the marginal effect of between group inequality. And finally, when the dependent variable instead is ethnic voting. Again, ethnic voting is a continuous variable. So here we use OLS. So in model 5, this is the only time in which when I run a regression of only the between group inequality, we do find that between group inequality increases the level of ethnic voting. So groups that have higher score between group inequality are more likely to vote along ethnic lines. But again, when we include the interaction term, we have the same basic pattern. So between group inequality increases ethnic voting, and the magnitude of the effect reduces within group inequality. One thing I must say also is that model 6 outperform model 5 when we compare the fit of the models. Okay. So here I present a different figure, just not to show you 3 times the same, but it's the findings are very similar if I were to show the other ones. So this shows the effect of between group inequality on the predicted ethnic voting value in ethnic groups with low and high within group inequality levels. Okay. So here, in both cases, we have the level of between group inequality. So here and here. Here we have the predicted ethnic voting value. And here these are is an ethnic group with a low level within group inequality. This is set as being the 10th percentile of the distribution. And here for an ethnic group with a high level of within group inequality, this is set as being the 90 percentile, so 90. And as you can see here, between group inequality does increase ethnic voting, whereas it basically has no effect. I have many, of course, additional findings. I will not discuss here into details, but one of them is that usually the effect, the magnitude of the effect, and also whether there's an effect or not, doesn't tend to depend on whether the ethnic group is rich or is poor. So it seems that it's really ethnic inequality, not whether you're much richer or much poorer, that drives the effect. And I think this is interesting because, among other things, it suggests that the relationship is not completely driven by grievances. So it's not grievances per se that drive the effect of inequality. So rich groups are as likely, for example, to stage a democratic breakdown or a coup than poor groups. So I provide tests of both causal mechanism. So again, just as a reminder, the first causal mechanism was that ethnic inequality affects ethnic identification. I provide 2 tests of this. Both of them use the Afrobarometer. The unit of analysis is the respondent. The Afrobarometer has 2 questions here that I use to test it. So the first question asks respondent directly whether they identify more closely with their ethnicity or with their nationality. So again, this I think is a pretty direct test of the argument. So because I can look at the effect of ethnic inequality on ethnic identification per se. The second test is more indirect, and it asks individuals whether they trust people from other ethnicity. Here, the rationale is that if you identify more closely with your own ethnicity, you should be less trustful of people of other ethnic groups. Okay, but this is more of an indirect test, I think, of the argument. Here, I will go quickly over the results. So again, here, the dependent variable is ethnic identification. Higher values means higher value that people identify more with their ethnicity than with their nationality. As you can see, between group inequality increases ethnic identification, and again, the magnitude reduces within group inequality. So we have support for that. So that test supports the first mechanism. And also, the second test shows that when between group inequality increases, people become less trustful of people of other ethnicity. And again, the magnitude of the negative effect weakens, so it becomes more positive. So the interaction here is positive. Okay? Here I don't show graphs, but they are in the papers, and they are similar to what I showed before. Okay? So I have strong support for the first mechanism, relatively strong support. Again, according to the second mechanism, ethnic inequality will affect policy preferences. To test this, my co-authors and I construct an indicator of the average support for redistribution for each ethnic group. So basically, the degree to which the average member of the group supports redistribution towards the poor. Okay. And we use a large number of questions, dozens of questions, but they really center on 4 main topics. Okay. So the first one is the degree to which the respondent is averse to inequality. The second one is whether they believe the state should intervene to reduce inequality. The third one is whether they believe the state should provide services like education. And finally, the last group of questions are about whether people have positive or negative views of the private sector and privatization. Okay. Donc, for each of these questions, they are recoded from 0 to 1, where 1 means higher support for redistribution. Then we average all of these questions for each respondent. That gives us a score from 0 to 1 for each person. And then we average all members of the group, which gives us a measure at the ethnic group level. Okay? From 0 to 1, where 1 means higher support for redistribution. So here is the test that we run. So here the dependent variable, again, is support for redistribution towards the poor. So in order to test, so again here, the key argument is that the divergence of the poor and rich group will increase with between group inequality. So we need to distinguish between the effect on poor and rich group. In order to do that, we create a dummy variable, so 0 to 1, that takes the value 1 if the ethnic group is, the members of the groups are on average poorer than other citizens of the same country. And then we interact each of the variables with that dummy variable. So if we want to see the effect of between group inequality only among rich group, all of these are equal to 0. So we can just focus on the 3 top scores here. So that means that among rich group, between group inequality reduces support for redistribution, and again we have the same interactive effect. Okay. If we want to look at the gap itself between rich and poor groups, we can look at so these are linear models, so we can just look at the interaction terms, whether these two interaction terms, whether they're significant, and they are, so it means that the gap, so the effect of between group inequality, so the difference that it has on poor and rich group is statistically significant, okay, at the 1% level. Okay, so I also have support for the second mechanism. Okay, so in this presentation, I have argued that between group inequality will foster democratic breakdowns, coups, ethnic voting, and ethnic voting when within group inequality is low. And I also have proposed 2 mechanisms, one based on ethnic identification and the other one on preferences over economic policies. And I find strong support for the hypothesis and also for the mechanism using a large data set. I will say that the work put together makes basically 4 main contributions. The first one is to analyze and test the effect of ethnic inequality on new topics, and I think this is the main contribution. Also, I look at the effect the interaction within and between group inequality. So basically, allow the relationship to be conditional. So it could, I could find that it's not conditional if the result could have showed that, but I allow it to be conditional. So I construct a new data set on between and within group inequality. And also, finally, I empirically show that that ethnic inequality does affect ethnic identification and policy preferences, which has not, to my knowledge, been shown before. Okay. So there are different ways I think this work could be extended. Okay, so some of them, for example, will be about applying these kind of arguments to different dependent variables. And I don't think this is necessarily a straightforward extension, in the sense that I think that the effect of ethnic inequality will depend on the particular process we are looking at. So one of the factor I think is interesting is support for right-wing populism. Actually, I have other work that I'm doing right now, not on ethnic inequality, but on right-wing populism. And actually, I think that this could be interesting, because right-wing populist parties and candidates often make very strong ethnic or nationalist appeals. Also, I think it will be interesting to look at the effect of ethnic inequality on diverse forms of political unrest. So again, it's possible that ethnic inequality will have different type of effect on different forms, depending. So, for example, the example I give here, it's possible it has a different effect on civil wars and on coups, if you remember from the previous literature. Okay. And another possible topic will be to look at public good provision, and there's some work on the effect of between group inequality on public good provision, but I'm not aware of any work on between and within group inequality. Other extension also will be to look at the interaction between other cleavages than ethnicity and income, for example, religion and or race. And again, I don't think this is a straightforward extension, because some of the mechanism will not work if we don't, for example, in the case of the second mechanism on policy preference over economic policies, it doesn't work if there's no economic aspect or no inequality aspect, okay, in the cleavage. So thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Yeah, thank you very much, Christian, for very impressive presentation. But I'm still thinking about the last point, applicability of your concept. You mentioned at the beginning, you started with that, saying that civil war we could interpret as an ethnic war, or civil war as an ethnic coup d'etat. And I'm thinking about very famous or notorious examples of that kind in our history. What came to my mind is, for example, the genocide in Rwanda. Remember in 1994, when the ruling one ethnic group, it was, as far as I remember, Hutu, yeah, they repressed the other ethnic group, Tutsi. Yeah. As a result of that, they killed over 1 million, I guess, so it's significant part, 15 or 20% of the population, and UN declared it a genocide. And if we applied your concept, it works perfectly. So we could guess that if, according to your scheme, according to your logic, the oppressed ethnic group, what was Tutsi, if the differences, the inequality within the group was less, maybe they could organize themselves better, organize sort of, I don't know, partisan movement and prevent these terrible losses, 1 million. So this scheme works. One ethnic group versus the other one. As a result, we have civil war or coup d'etat, and there are a lot of cases of this kind. But I'm thinking about different cases. For example, Russian civil war 100 years ago. Remember, red versus white, white versus red. In terms of ethnic, does your concept applied? It was millions of one Russians fighting with another millions of Russians. And finally, millions of Russians were killed, and even more millions were emigrated. So Russians versus Russians, no other ethnic groups. Does your concept work in this case? Explaining how it works because of inequality in this group or that group, or another more modern case of Khmer Rouge. Remember, yeah, it's end of 70s, beginning of 80s, when one part of Khmer's ethnic groups who gained power, pro-communist Pol Pot, killed the other group. What ethnic groups? The same Khmers, the same belief, the same, even in terms of, we can't say that, for example, the rich part of one ethnic group oppressed the poor, or the poor oppressed. It was one more or less comparable group. Does this concept explain the mechanism of this conflict? No, I'm not sure. So my question is, what do you think could we explain all these significant social, political unrest or civil war by inter-ethnic groups conflicts?
Do I respond right now, or okay, okay? Yeah. So thank you very much for the question. It's a very good. It's an excellent question. So I will respond it in two ways. So the first part will be that I don't necessarily think that these mechanisms will explain all cases. So I definitely not all cases. I don't think there's any variable that will explain all cases of civil wars or coups. I just these are quite a very large event, like a democratic like a regime breakdown or civil war. There are things that have many variables that affect them. I really don't think that one variable will explain all cases. So here it's more to explain, to help explain, so again, not explain completely, some form of, for example, ethnic coups, of coups. So some coups have an ethnic component, and others don't. The same thing for civil wars. Some civil wars, like the case of Rwanda, clearly had an ethnic component. Others don't, like the Russian case. So in terms of theory, the argument only apply to those that have that kind of component. And in terms of the empirics, in most of the models, that the dependent variable is, let's say, a coup, these are only ethnic coups. So the reason why I use the Rossler data is that, for example, if in Africa, so this is only in Africa, if there are coups in one country, there's a coup, but it has no ethnic component to that coup, it's not in the data set. It's only if ethnicity is important. And the same thing, so actually I don't use civil wars per se in my own empirics, but most of the authors that looked at civil war also use data that is only ethnic civil wars. Or they will use both and then show robustness tests. But there is definitely data for civil wars. For coups, there's only data for Africa. I'm not aware of for the other region, and that's the reason why I focus on Africa on that part. Yeah. So, but again, I don't think that one variable will explain. Even in those cases, I don't think that within and between group inequality will explain all of these ethnic coups. Or I just think it's one contributing factor, and I try to control for possible other explanation that could be correlated with that factor. Okay, thank you.
Talk was clearly about ethnic groups, right? So that was the whole idea. But you did have kind of a couple of explanations why it works this way, and one was group identity, right? And another one was similarity of economic interests, right? So, and this probably kind of general things. Right, so you can identify clearly with your religious group, and you can identify with your class if there are classes. So presumably the logic can also apply to something else, right? But could you speculate? I mean, would these two factors, group identity and similarity of economic interests, be also present in our things, like Russian revolution or whatever it is?
Yeah, it could also be related, although, like in the case of Russia, I don't think there were any kind of, like, say, cultural identities as far as I know. It was purely class, and so in that case, it's just interclass conflict, and we have interclass civil wars. So in that case, perhaps inequality within these social class could be a factor, and the extent to which there's inequality between social class. So the same type of ideas, although I don't think identity plays a strong an effect, at least in groups that are not, that don't have a cultural aspect. So I think there's something specific about culture, just because you can change social class, usually, or unless it's some kind of aristocracy, you can change social class, but it's much more difficult to change ethnicity, at least at the individual level. Ethnicity can become more or less important for a group. So I think there's still something special about ethnicity. Yes.
Did you see anything that suggested the relative size or number of ethnicities in each case made a difference? Yeah, big or small, or if it was, you know, kind of a dichotomy, or if there was a highly diverse situation.
Yeah. So I didn't find it may be so. I didn't find that something like ethnic fractionalization. So these kind of index will give the probability, if you take two people randomly in a country, the probability that they are from different ethnic groups. So it will capture the size, the relative size of the groups, and the number of groups you have. Because if you have, let's say, 10 groups, then the probability that you take two people and they are from different groups is higher. So it captures both of them. And I look at the interaction with inequality, and I didn't find much. And my understanding is that other authors that also look at between group inequality don't find that much of an interaction with fractionalization itself, so the degree to which a country is diverse. And in general, also the literature don't find that ethnic diversity has such a big impact on politics. So countries that are highly diverse don't tend to have, for example, more civil wars than those that are, let's say, in the middle. If anything, it seems that it's countries like the most unstable situation is if you have one group, let's say, that is 51% and the other group that is like 49. So it's kind of in the middle that will be the most kind of instability. But even then, I didn't find anything in terms of a conditional effect in my own work. Yeah. Thank you.
Well, I bet people in this room will know this answer. So thinking about this as a modeling approach, in which you have two different groups, and you can think of them as an individual-based model or an agent-based model. It seems to me the characterization of the hypotheses for within and between group driving major events, in this case, civil war or unrest, could be incorporated within a model relatively easily. So my question is, have there been a similar set of metrics done with agent-based or other, I mean, there's also all the sort of game theory kinds of things, but has that been done, and is that concordant with the kinds of results that you get, or is it really different, or is that not a worthwhile approach?
It's definitely worthwhile, I think. So I think it's something that could be done. I don't think it has been done that much, though. There is, Ajimolu and Robinson in the 2006, so the economic origin of democracy and dictatorship, a book in 2006, do have some extension of their main model that includes some kind of second cleavage that could be seen as being cultural. Actually, I must say so. As I said, for the first paper here that I published was from my dissertation, and I actually had a model in my dissertation, but I didn't. When I published the paper, I didn't include the model. It was not like necessarily the best model.
Was it? Can you describe the model? Was it an agent-based?
Agent-based, yeah. So basically, two different groups. There was a parameter for inequality within group, a parameter for inequality between groups, so between and within group. And basically, two groups could come together to do a coup d'etat to reverse the democracy. And basically, it was much more about the second mechanism here, about distributional conflict. Two groups can come together if, let's say, so there's an elite and a master's for the two ethnic group. If the two elites come together, that will be a case in which we'll then have a class-based autocracy afterward, a class-based coup. And if the two members of the same ethnic group came together, that was going to be an ethnic-based coup that will give an ethnic-based regime afterwards. And basically, the idea was that when there's a lot of inequality between ethnic group and low level of inequality within group, then you will have more likely to have ethnic-based coup. And when you had a lot of inequality between social class and then low level of inequality between group, you will have more class-based coup. So relatively simple, but yeah. So that was basically the main idea.
Cool. Thank you. Yeah, I knew Sergey had a model, but
yeah.
Okay. Thank you for your talk. So I would like to ask two questions. One is think about a fictional scenario in which everybody in the country is equal to one another, so there's no difference at all.
Yeah.
That would be the case of maybe communist country, right? In this case, I think your model would say that would be less likely to have some kind of conflict, right? But history shows that those kinds of structure are more likely to break down. So could you talk a little bit about that? Yeah, the second question may I ask after you.
Okay. So in that case, if everybody was equal, so both between and within group, it's not necessarily that my models or my argument says that they will be that society will be more stable. Is that it will not be unstable along ethnic lines. It's not ethnicity. So it's not they will not have ethnic base, or we will be unlikely to have ethnic-based instability. We could have other type of instability that could be driven by something completely different. But if, let's say, we have the people from different ethnic group are very equal, both within and between group, we should not expect, according to my argument, to see ethnic-based violence or ethnic-based, but it could be other type.
Yeah, and in one of your slides, you show the between group inequality and within group inequality. So I was just trying to think about the interpretation, right? So if you have like two groups and they have little within inequality, there is going to be higher between group inequality, right? Because they are really different. But if within group inequality is high, these two groups are kind of going to be the same group. Therefore, between group inequality would not be important. So
I'm not sure I understand.
So can you show your slide that you show between group inequality, low and high? Yeah, this one.
Okay.
So if there is low within group inequality, it means that these two groups are really different between one another. So therefore there is going to be high between group inequality because the groups are different. But as I increase within group inequality, these two groups are kind of going to overlap and be looking more like each other.
Yeah.
So my question is, can you therefore kind of reduce the explanation to just the level of within group inequality, in the sense that the real mechanism that allows or not for emergence or conflict is within group inequality, and based on changing on that, the other one's going to be important. I'm just trying to find what's the real mechanism, because in there you find correlations, right? So it's just like what's enabling the existence of this. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think we need both of them, because let's say if we were to fix between group inequality, so if we were to fix within group inequality, let's say within group inequality is fixed, then if we were to change between group inequality, it still matters. So I don't think it's that one is more important than the other. I really think that in this case is the combination. It's true that they will overlap at one point. So if we are, let's say, here and we always increase within group inequality, they will overlap at one point. But if we had been here, they will have overlap before and much more. And if we had been here, they will not have overlap at all. So I think that the effect is still conditional in that case. Sorry?
We are speaking about total equality within and between.
Yeah. Yeah.
So presumably you should be able to predict, like having the data, you should be able to predict which country is more likely to go for a coup or for whatever. So have you looked at your list of countries trying to predict the future? And also, I think probably some of this is applicable to Western democracies, right? Where they're kind of maybe moving one way or another.
Yeah, so I think these are two very good questions. In terms of predicting, no, I didn't do it. I didn't look at which one. I will guess it's those with that. So it's a bit always difficult because those that were likely to have coups in the future are those with these type of condition, and countries with these type of condition had coups in the past. So they are two conflicting things here, because if you had coups in the past, that increases your chances of having a coup in the future. So because yeah, I mean the behavior of the actor will depend on what happened before. At the same time, they had the same condition. So if I were to do a prediction, I will just say it will be I can give probability, not necessarily like it will not be like which one, but it will be which group have more probability. That I could do based on the data. In terms of the Western countries, that's a bit related to what I think I finished with right-wing populism. I think that is something, especially for within group inequality, that could perhaps explain. I'm not sure exactly how. I will need to think more about that, but it could explain a little bit the cohesion of different ethnic group and how that, because and the reason why as I'm speaking about right-wing populism here is that if we were to look at perhaps some kind of threat to democracy in the Western world, that's probably where it comes from. So that's the reason why I started to look at that question. But one thing I must say is that in the ethnic voting, so like for example in that in these regression and also in democratic breakdown, Western countries are there. Okay, so Western countries are included. So one of the ethnic group that has a high level of ethnic voting is the French Canadian. So, which is I'm French Canadian. So, so Western countries are included.
Do you have any intuition about the spatial distribution and whether the ethnic groups are separated at the state level, the neighborhood level, or the house level? Does that impact their likelihood of having civil wars? They may be completely separate groups, but if they're spatially mixed or spatially unmixed, that may impact the tendency for civil war.
Yeah, so I think this is another very good question. So we did look in some, so both for civil, so we look at this for ethnic voting and coups, I'm pretty sure also, so that we have looked at whether groups are concentrated within a region or whether they are, let's say, spread, and whether they live more in ethnically homogeneous region. The finding was that the effect was in the predicted direction in no matter how they are dispersed, whether they are dispersed. I'm not sure if the magnitude of, I can't recall, I will have to check. Actually, I mean, I have one of the papers here, so I could check, we can talk after the talk, whether the magnitude of the effect was stronger among groups that are concentrated or within region or a part of a region. I would think that should be the case, but I cannot tell you for sure. I can't remember.
Okay, so you mentioned how you calculate between group inequality for a group and within group inequality for a group. So you did Gini index, and for the Britian group inequality you saw within the group and everyone else.
Yeah.
So how did you go from between group inequality per group to one number, I believe, which is what you use in your statistics? So do you take the average of between group inequality for each group and then?
So all the results that I showed are at the ethnic group level. So it's these are not at the country level. So these are
Okay.
at the ethnic group level. So I looked at the between and within group inequality score of a given ethnic group, look at its impact, let's say, on ethnic voting or breakdown. But it's still at the ethnic group level. When I do at the country level, these were constructed, let's say, in the world politics. The way it was constructed is that I had taken the weighted average of the between group and within group inequality. So weighted by the size of the population. It may not be the best method. In another paper, I had used also the decomposition. So there's some form of decomposition, but it gives you also an overall. So there's the overlap. So it gives you a within group, between group, and an overlap score. I can't exactly remember. It's a type of decomposition of the Gini coefficient, I think. I had done also as a robustness test at one point. So thank you. Thank you.